Salams from the People's Dispatch studios here in New Delhi. I'm Siddhant Ani and you're watching Daily Debrief. On the show today, we're talking about US airstrikes in Syria, how the US forced the United Kingdom to ban Huawei, and major developments in the 1MDG case in Malaysia. First up, the United States carried out air raids in eastern Syria, targeting infrastructure facilities that it claimed are used by groups affiliated with Iran's elite Revolutionary Guard Corps. In a statement on Wednesday, US military Central Command said that the air raids in Syria's Deir az-Zor region were ordered by US President Joe Biden to, in the words of Central Command spokesperson Joe Buccino, I quote, they were necessary to protect and defend US personnel, end quote. I spoke to Abdul for more details on these latest air raids. Welcome back to Daily Debrief. Abdul, first up, the US Central Command has issued this statement. Tell us a bit about the region where the attacks were targeted and who they were intended against.
Well, the exact location has not been mentioned in this statement, and neither in any reports which has come in different media organizations. But this is broadly said that this is the attacks happen in Deir al-Zur, one of the provinces of Syria, which is basically also the base where the American base is, the Al-Tanf. And this is also an oil-rich region. There has been various reports of attacks and counterattacks between US and Syrian forces on the ground. Just minor clashes in the past. As per the statement, this was the attack was primarily a retaliation. That is what the US Army is claiming, retaliation against the attacks which happened on 15th of August, in which 3 drones were launched on Al-Tanf. None of those drones did any harm. Of course, they were intercepted before they could do anything. And as per the statement, the US Army claims that those drones were fired by the Iranian-backed. This is basically a way of saying that the Syrian pro-Syrian government factions, army, whatever you call it, basically were involved in the attack on Tulf, and therefore this is a retaliation against them. We know that at this moment, in that particular region, there are 2 basic forces. The US claim of ISIS being involved and being there, of course, that is there, but that is not a major force. It is a minor element in that region. It is primarily the US and US-backed SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, versus the Syrian government and the allies of the Syrian government, which Israel and US often claim that there is a direct involvement of Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps, and therefore they are responsible for all the attacks. And whatever they are targeting, it is primarily those elements which are directly affiliated to Iranian groups and not the Syrian state group. So in whatever way we see it, whatever way the statement is framed and the US claims are, it is primarily an attack on the Syrian and pro-Bashar al-Assad forces on the ground. We know that there has been, I think, as I said before, there has been various instances of attacks and counterattacks, primarily because the Syrian claim that this particular base is illegal. It is used for different kinds of anti-Syrian activities, for example, stealing the Syria's natural resources, oil, and so on and so forth, and also aiding and training, providing armaments to the forces which are fighting against the Syrian government. So it is basically what Syria claims, that the US presence in that region is primarily to prolong the war in the country. And this particular attack basically adds to that particular claim.
So Abdul, given the strategic importance of the region, like you were mentioning, and the all kinds of things that are going on there, whether it's the pilferage of natural resources or training of various factions, what are the wider implications that these attacks are likely to have on the situation on the ground in the country?
Well, ever since Joe Biden has come to power in 2021, there has been various attacks uh, in the region carried out by the US. Keep this in mind that that region is already facing attacks from Turkey in the last. Of course, in 2019 there was a full-fledged invasion, but since the beginning of this year, particularly after May, Turkish forces have started firing artillery and using drones to attack what they claim the Kurdish workers' party. Um, so if we see this see all of this in the context that Syria is already suffering from a war which is now a decade plus old, and because of that war, almost half Syrian population is forced to flee their homes. Either they are internally migrants, or they have gone outside the country, forced to. So if the war continues the way it is, and instead of finding a solution to these strikes and counter strikes, particularly after the defeat of ISIS in 2017, 2019, whatever dates we take as a point of reference. I think if these attacks continue, that despite the fact that there is no real threat to the security on the ground, then basically this is an imperialist war, a war imposed on Syria, and this irrespective of the suffering of the people. So it means all the parties which are involved in the clashes do not care about finding a solution and finding a way to address the concerns of people. And we are not talking about a couple of dozens of people or something like that. We are talking about millions of people. Also, if the strikes and counter strikes go on, the economic concerns which Syria is facing at this moment, we know because of the war, the capability of the Syrian government to address certain economic concerns of whatever people remaining inside the country and whatever refugees who are trying to come back to their homes are already limited. If the war continues and the resources, the way they are looted and pilfered, if this continues, of course, that it means we are capability of the Syrian state to address the concerns of the people. So I think this will complicate not only the situation on the ground, basically make the Syrian government more inefficient, but it will also basically, in a way, provide different kinds of execution for different kinds of resistance, whether it is whether you like it or not, the resistance will be the groups which will misuse the resistance, the anger of people to recruit for various reasons, the forces like ISIS. We are basically providing a justification for such forces to re-emerge. And the US and other forces involved in the region should realize it and that try to address it as soon as possible.
Right. Thanks very much, Abdul, for putting into context actually what is going on there and how culpable I guess all parties involved in this conflict are in their own sort of spheres. Thanks again. Next up, the Sunday Times, a British publication, recently published an edited extract from a book that is soon to be published, written by investigative journalist Richard Kerbaj. The extract tells us how the US essentially forced the United Kingdom to block Chinese tech giant Huawei from participating in the development of a 5G network in that country. According to the author and several other sources familiar with the story, the UK was originally in line to engage with Huawei in its 5G network development, but after extended pressure from the United States on London and sanctions from the US against Huawei, the Boris Johnson government eventually banned the company from operating within the United Kingdom. Anish is with us now for more on that story. Anish, we've got you today in the midst of an exciting bit of news break that will come as a surprise to many, but not to others. What is the latest? What is this Sunday Times excerpt telling us about what happened with Huawei and the UK's sort of engagement with that company?
Yeah, so the excerpt is from a book that, and it's basically an interview with the former chief of the GCHQ, Kieran Martin. The GCHQ, or the Government Communications Headquarters in the United Kingdom, is basically an intelligence agency for telecommunication systems in the United Kingdom. And at the time, they had assessed, while the government was in talks with expanding the 5G technology in the United Kingdom with Huawei. And they had assessed that Huawei did not pose any major security risks to the system or to national security as a whole. So, but obviously we know in 2020, Huawei from the contract and had asked all its equipments and machineries and infrastructure to be removed from British telecom systems.
Networks. Right.
Exactly. And the reason we know now is because Matthew Pottinger, who was the deputy national security advisor to the Trump administration at the time, spent about 5 hours yelling at the cabinet, the British cabinet, to trying to convince them that there is going to be major security risks to the United States and its national interest. How, they did not explain. That's what the excerpt says. Martin, who was present at the meeting, was very clear that while the British government at the time agreed with the United States about how China supposedly posed a security risk, and there was the supposed need to contain China in the larger scheme of things, they were not convinced why any deals with Huawei in the expansion of the establishment of the 5G technology in the country would actually be a problem. There was literally nothing that the United States could offer at the time, but just the fact that China poses a security risk. And the fact that this person pretty much yelled, who's not even a senior, he is obviously a senior official in many ranks, but he's not at par with ministers and the prime minister to begin with.
Definitely not an elected official.
Exactly. And he's somebody who gets to talk down a sovereign government and push them into taking a decision, even though it was taken a year later, shows how desperate Trump administration for this sort of anti-China narrative, especially targeting Huawei and its 5G and all sorts of deals that Huawei was having with several countries in the supposedly Five Eyes alliance, as well as the Western world at large. So in all of these cases, we can very clearly see how United States was in many ways intervening in basic trade policies and commerce policies of the governments, of sovereign governments that it's allied with, rather than and it also shows the political nature with which Huawei was targeted at the time. And it just makes it very clear how the trade war was essentially a political war rather than something that actually had to do with any kind of trade malpractices that the US was claiming at the time.
Choosing. Right. Fair enough, Anish. So we figured out, I guess, how the US manages to put its self-interest before the interest, I suppose, of even its allies. And post-fact also very rarely comes to their aid when the need does arise. We also know the situation that Europe is in from an economic standpoint. The threats of recession, high rates of inflation everywhere, and 5G is sort of the next big thing in terms of the global also telecom industry, IT, and such like. In this context, are these new findings or revelations likely to have any sort of impact on how things proceed in terms of spectrum technology or the future of even this trade war as it is?
Well, the revelations as such does not offer any kind of new turn of events. It just confirms a lot of sneaking suspicion that many had at the time. And obviously with Boris Johnson's government set to end in the next month or so, we are not really seeing any kind of political impact being, you know, being imminent for him in the coming days. But it did affect the United Kingdom's chance of having 5G technology on their own. One of the things that the ban at the time, that when the trade block happened and when Huawei was blocked from the 5G technology contract, it actually set United Kingdom years behind in actually developing 5G technology of its own, making it dependent on obviously its other Western counterparts. But they were not at par with what Huawei was achieving at the time. We also know that the cost of dismantling the entire infrastructure that was in the works at the time is something around £2 billion. And that is something that the US is definitely not going to reimburse the United Kingdom for, but it is something that the United Kingdom, the British people have to take on their own. So exactly. So this is creating, this only shows how US foreign policy interest often comes at the cost of its allies very often. And this is just one of the example and the tip of the iceberg, so to speak, in many ways.
All right, thanks for that update, Anish. Stick around because we're talking about Malaysia up next, major developments there, and we'll sort of pull you into that conversation as well. And finally, ex-Prime Minister Najib Razak of Malaysia has begun a 12-year prison sentence after losing a final appeal in a corruption case linked to the looting of the 1MDB state fund, with the country's top court unanimously upholding his conviction as well as sentence in that case. Najib therefore becomes Malaysia's first head of government to be imprisoned, or became rather, when he was taken to Kajang prison on the outskirts of the Malaysian capital Kuala Lumpur on Tuesday after the court's orders were received. Opposition leaders, activists and many civil society organizations hailed the court's quick ruling in the appeal case, calling it a victory for Malaysians who voted to remove Najib from office in 2018. The 5-member federal court panel said it found the High Court's decision that was given earlier was absolutely correct and that Najib's appeal was, I quote, devoid of any merits. The Chief Justice, while reading out the verdict, I quote again, said, this is a simple and straightforward case of abuse of power, criminal breach of trust and money laundering, end quote. Najib has been out on bail pending the appeals process since his sentence was first given out in 2020. He was ordered to begin serving time and also pay a fine of approximately $47 million. Anish is with us still and has more details on this developing story. Anish, a fairly major development then in this case, and the first sort of perhaps more to come, indicating how things might go, at least depending on the evidence provided there. Tell us a little bit about the background of this case and why this is so significant at this point.
Well, the 1MJB case is something that not only rocked Malaysian politics, but pretty much had its effects globally felt at the time. We can actually, like, beginning with the scale of it from something like $100 million to something close to $5 billion worth of money being siphoned from a sovereign fund in Malaysia, that is the 1MDB, which is the sovereign fund created for various projects. And it was pretty much revealed in 2015 when the agency was found to be in debt of close to $12 billion. And there was no explanation of how that happened. What was found was that Najib Razak, the prime minister at the time, himself was involved in siphoning of money to several accounts, offshore accounts and shell companies at the time. And that actually created only compounded the debt crisis that actually made the 1MDB sovereign fund insolvent in the next few years. So this was definitely a major scandal, obviously, for Malaysia. But we now see that it actually had involvements of several officials from other countries, including Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, and also people from across the world, including the United States, where the Goldman Sachs was actually also involved in the case, where they were given something, at least they were given something close to $300 million for as a bribe to assess a certain project that was unviable in Malaysia at the time. And there was also talks of how its leadership at the time or officials for that, were also involved in siphoning monies to some of their accounts. And they had to settle the lawsuit in the United States to something close to $2.5 billion, if I'm not wrong, settlement. So we can only imagine the scale of the actual money laundering that happened. So these are the issues that came up at the time. Obviously, there were lawsuits and investigations happening in multiple countries at the same time. And Najib's arrest, which was given a few years ago, is only being upheld by the higher courts in Malaysia right now. And it comes kind of like a vindication in many ways, because this really just rocked the entire political system at the time, and created political instability that made gave weaker governments in the next few years after the 2018 elections.
Right.
And in all of this, Najib's role only shows how it was easy for a government at the time to siphon money in ways that nobody could explain how it happened. A lot of the money is still unaccounted for. Investigations are continuing, lawsuits are continuing. We might see more arrests or convictions in the coming years, but we are not sure. But this definitely is a landmark in many ways, because this is also the first time that a former head of government in Malaysia is being jailed, is about to go to jail at least.
Right. Anish, of course, we'll ask you to keep tracking that story as it develops, and also depending on the impact, the wider impact that it might have on the political scenario in Malaysia. Thanks very much for the update. That's all we have on this episode of Daily Debrief. From Abdul, Anish, myself, and the entire team here at People's Dispatch, thank you very much for tuning in. As always, for more details on all of these stories, you can head over to our website, peoplesdispatch.org, and give us a follow on the social media platform of your choice for regular updates. We'll be back same time, same place tomorrow. Until then, stay safe. Goodbye.